All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
How you doing?
Doing well.
Okay, good. Well, today
Yeah.
is Wednesday, May 28th, and I'll start you off with another Trump thing. So Trump
Oh.
tweeted on Truth Social.
Yeah.
He's a nonstop source of entertainment,
Right.
this guy. But he tweeted something. I'm sure you saw it on Truth Social, or he truthed out something. He said,
Uh-huh.
"What Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia. And I mean really bad. He's playing with
Right.
fire." So yeah, it sounds like World War III is back on the menu. What do you what do you make of all this?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it shows, I think, as Peskov and some of the other Russian officials have said, that he's just very misinformed. I think we concluded in the last program that he's probably just watching mainstream news and believing it. And it's hard to understand how that could be. The president is supposed to, have this enormous intelligence apparatus beneath him that is, supplying him with up to date information. He's got Tulsi Gabbard there, but maybe he's just not listening, or maybe, something. I have trouble believing that, well, maybe I don't have that much trouble, but that he's getting that kind of information from intelligence agencies, and certainly from Tulsi Gabbard. I have trouble believing it. So what's going on here? Does he hear it and not really pay attention? Then he watches the news and he finds it very convincing. I remember a similar incident actually in his first term. I guess it's not quite. It was different in many ways, but it showed how he seemed to favor mainstream news sources over intelligence, and that was there was an incident within Syria that was um, that the West claimed was, a chemical attack on Syrian civilians. And that's how it was portrayed on CNN and the other mainstream networks. And apparently, his wife, Trump's wife, Melania, watched it and was emotionally affected and went to him and, told him, you got to do something. And then what I've also heard was that he was briefed, his intelligence um, the intelligence officers that briefed him gave him a very different picture. They said there's actually no proof that the Syrian government was behind this. This is something we've got to look into. Um, but he went with CNN basically, and launched missiles against Syria, and that was the first sign that he was going to be kind of like all the other presidents. So I'm just wondering, is this the same thing? Does it, maybe it's not just him. All these presidents are more interested in what they watch on the news and what their intelligence, officers tell them. If they are telling him the truth, that's so. First of all, it just seems like he's just terribly misinformed. It's hard to believe that he would be that misinformed. We're hoping that as a result of these conversations with Putin, that he was being educated, and maybe he has been to a certain extent, but he just seems to be very vulnerable to manipulation by all those war hawks within his administration, and we know they're there and they're very close to him, and manipulation by the media at large.
Right. It seems like it's a real battle for Trump's mind right now, and unfortunately, Trump's mind is not the strongest in terms of holding up to being consistent to your principles and beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
It's only been what 4 or 5 months of his presidency, and it seems
Not
like
even
they've
that, right?
okay, yeah, I don't even know
Yeah,
when
well,
it
maybe
is.
4 months. Yeah,
Right.
4 months of his presidency.
Yeah. Anyways, they've seemed it seems like the neocons and the establishment have been able to chip away at him, and I don't know. He changes his mind often, so maybe this isn't something to get too worked up about. But it is a worrying development. He hasn't been able to extricate himself from the war. I feel like he's getting fed up, and tweeting these things, saying that Putin's in real trouble. It's troubling, and something that you brought up in our last conversation as well is just you've talked about when there is a major Russian offensive. How will Trump be able to handle that? If Trump can't handle this retaliatory drone strike and missile strike that was pretty minimal in terms of causing civilian deaths or casualties, was a response to hundreds of missiles being drones being fired into Russia, shutting down the Moscow's airports, things like this, having Putin's helicopter flying into a drone swarm from the Ukrainians as well on the back of all this. And it sounds like Trump was like, that's it. It's kind of, I think it's surprising to a lot of people, myself included, and I think to the Russians, how quickly Trump kind of snapped on this. Do you think so?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just not surprised by him anymore. I've seen, these flips and flops so many times, both during his first term and now, that I'm not surprised. And it's just a mistake to put too much, weight on anything that he says. He will contradict himself within a week or so. That I think that's a given. The problem is that, okay, he flip-flops, and maybe he'll be saying, nice things about Putin in a week, and all the European leaders and all the hawks, the neocons within the administration are going to be panicking about that. That may happen in a week or two, but then he'll flip-flop again. The problem is that he is up against a lot, and he needs to be disciplined and consistent and to work out a strategy, on how to deal with it, because he really is up against the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy. He's up against, all the European governments, and the media. It's just almost entirely, there are very powerful forces arrayed against him. If he really wants to make a deal, I think that's impossible, actually achieving a settlement. But even if he wants to walk away with it, okay, that's the only thing that's maybe even possible, that he could just walk away from this conflict. But to do that, again, because he's fighting such powerful forces, and there's going to be such tremendous pressure down the road for the reasons that we've given, he's got to be very well prepared and consistent, and have worked out some kind of strategy. And he also has to run a tight ship, and none of those things are true. So it's just like, even if, he's going to start speaking kindly about Putin, it's a sign that he's just not up to the challenge here. And I think that, we've got all those forces around him who, they know what they want to do. They want Biden 2.0. And I think they're eventually going to get it, because, because Trump hasn't worked out an alternative, to their strategy. It's just that their forces are, he's the president, so, he can throw a spanner in the gears there and slow things down from time to time. But if he's going to win the war, it's going to be more than his, occasional diktats or whatever. He's got to have put together a team, that's got to work in a unified manner and carry through with this. I just don't see that happening. Every sign, that everything that he's done so far tells us that he's just not up to the task.
Okay, well, if Trump is turning into Biden 2.0, does that mean that we are on just this inevitable march towards World War III or nuclear war, continued escalation?
Yeah, well, it's there are worrying signs. Of course, I think last time we talked about Mertz's statement on lifting restrictions, and it's not, he was a little bit ambiguous about it, but it strongly suggests that he's talking about the ATACMS missiles, right? That the Biden administration, up until November of last year, the Biden administration had restricted their use to post 2014 territory. But after November, they began strikes into places like Kursk and I think Bryansk and similar regions. And again, the issue is often not reported correctly. It's almost never reported accurately, and within the mainstream press, and even within the dissident press, it's sort of presented in a confused way. It's not that that these missiles have an especially long range. We've always had the ATACMS missiles, or rather, the Ukrainians have had them for a couple of years now. It's that these missiles, and particularly ATACMS, and other long-range missiles like the French Scalp and the British Storm Shadow, they require direct participation by NATO technicians. They have to be, the coordinates are provided, by NATO, but more than that, they actually have to be programmed. They cannot be operated by the Ukrainians themselves. So it's not a case of just giving them these missiles and saying, okay, you can do what you want with them. No, it's so every time one of these missiles is fired, it's being fired really by NATO as much as it is being fired by Ukraine. So NATO, in this case, is attacking Russia. Now, we're talking about the Crimea or the Donbass or whatever, Russia chose to look the other way because it's disputed territory, and the NATO could argue that this is actually Ukraine, so we're not attacking Russia. But when you're firing it into Kursk, for example, no, there's no dispute about that. This is Russian territory. So NATO is directly participating in an attack on Russia. So up until November, there were restrictions. The Ukrainians, we shouldn't say the Ukrainians, because again, it's really the Americans, were not allowed to fire these missiles into those pre-2014 regions. But starting November it began, and we saw a series of attacks. And we saw one clear retaliation, and that was the Oreshnik response. It was a signal. But then, of course, they continued, but they weren't effective because of the powerful Russian air defenses. And then the important thing is that they stopped when Trump took office. And I don't believe he ever made an official declaration, or anybody in his administration said that we're not doing this anymore. But they stopped. And we haven't seen any since his inauguration. So, that has been one of his main accomplishments, because that was putting us on an escalatory path. Maybe it won't, I hope it won't lead to World War III, or wouldn't have led to World War III, but it was making the situation very dangerous, because it was putting pressure on Putin to do something, similar, like actually strike, for example, a NATO base in outside of Ukraine, in Romania or Poland or something like that, which you would be justified in doing. NATO attacked Russia, Russia can attack NATO. That's the logic of it. And that's a terrifying logic. And now Merz is saying that he didn't actually mention the ATACMS, but he said these restrictions, they're not in place. And everybody assumes, I think, correctly, that he's talking about these ATACMS that were being fired into, and the Storm Shadows and the Scalps that were being fired into places like Kursk. But it's actually not clear. I think later, like, his vice chancellor contradicted him, said that this isn't happening, and then he said, well, these restrictions haven't ever been in place. So it's not clear what he's doing. I think he's he didn't mention the Taurus, but he talked about Germany itself, and that's the missile that Germany would provide, which has involves the same issues. It would require German technicians to actually fire those missiles. So, what is he doing? What is he saying? It's not clear. Has there actually been a change? Have Taurus missiles been provided? People are speculating about it, but they just don't know. They don't know really what he's up to. I know Alexander Mercouris, that he believes that Merz is just through these statements, is trying to apply pressure on Trump to lift the restrictions. And that may very well be true. But nobody really knows for sure.
Yeah, I also heard on the Duran that both Alexes believe that Taurus missiles are already in Ukraine. And we saw a similar thing with the ATACMS. It seems like the idea is we put these weapons in here, and then the pressure builds, and it's easy. It's like, look, they're already there. What are you doing? They're losing this war. You don't want to stop this Russian advance, right? We just, just sign this piece of paper, Mr. President, and then everything will be okay. It's already ready to go. Don't worry. And so that's the fear. Once they're there, then you can just work on building that pressure on the administration to get some approval. And it's just such an easy thing to do. They're already there.
Yeah.
But
they may very well be right. One thing you notice, well, again, Schultz never allowed the Taurus. That was like the one firm position he held firmly throughout his tenure. but when it became clear that Merz was going to be the next chancellor, there was already, there's the controversy, the old issue of whether or not these tourists should be supplied. And, again, it's the majority of German people are against it. I believe the German legislature is also against it. But Merz clearly wanted to do it. I think he had even made that statement during his campaign. When he was about to take office, I remember some sort of statement was released that, well, when he really understands the intelligence, he'll decide against it. And so he has not officially said it, but he or his administration has made some odd statements, more than once, is that they are now ending the transparency on weapons supplied to Ukraine. It used to be that the German government would accurately report, or at least they claim to be accurately reporting, everything that was being sent to Ukraine. But they said they were going to end that. And why is that? Maybe it is to cover up the fact that they're sending Taurus missiles. They know that it's controversial. It's not just controversial with the Russians, but with their own people. And so I think I think it's quite possible that those Taurus missiles might be there already.
You said these Taurus missiles can't be fired without U.S. assistance, right? They have U.S. components in them. They require U.S. satellite data. They can't be shot without U.S. involvement. Is that correct?
Well, I said that about the Scalp and the Storm Shadow. Now, I know Alex Christoforou said that that's true also of the Taurus, and he may well be correct. One thing in general is that all these systems are dependent on U.S. satellite data to a great extent. So I think there probably does need to be some level of U.S. involvement. I don't know how great it is in the case of the Taurus. Now, I believe, like with the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, they actually they have components that require, again, U.S. code, that you have to have actually U.S. technicians involved, at least in some stage. I don't know if that's true of the Taurus, but it may very well be.
If that's true, at least we know with the Storm Shadow and the Scalp, and possibly with the Taurus as well, I think this just symbolizes the epitome of vassalage. Like, what type of military do you have if you can't even use it the way that you want to use it? You have to wait for approval. It's like, me giving a toy to my kid, but I say, I tell them when they can play with it. Like, they don't have sovereignty, but they're the ones that are pushing us further and further towards this war, even though they can't even use their own equipment without us saying it. And it just becomes this game, a political game now, to just building pressure and just manipulation, constantly eating away at the U.S. to say, come on, Mr. President, don't look weak. Come on, you can do it. We're all ready to go. Give us our toys so that we can shoot them into Russia. It's really crazy. What type of military do you have if everything has to be okayed by the United States? The Europeans don't have a military.
Yeah, well, they don't have much of one, and it's highly dependent on the U.S. No question about that.
So if it's so highly dependent on the U.S., I think the worrying thing for us now is the fact that we haven't heard anything come out from the U.S. saying that, no, we're not striking deep into Russia. We heard Merz use the term that we can strike into Russia's hinterland. Let's go deep. And then there's nary a word of protest coming from the United States. And the U.S. is the one that apparently is the one that could shut it all down, say, no, you can't do that. You need our code approval. You need our satellite data. We're not letting this happen. But the fact they're not saying anything is, that troubles me a bit.
Yeah, no, that is worrying. I agree.
So how worried are you? Should we? I don't know if this is the thing with Trump. I don't want to blow things out of proportion because of one tweet, but we've seen a couple of consecutive things, just with him talking about he doesn't like it at all what Putin's doing. And then it just feels like the Kellogg plan is starting to take root in his brain.
Yeah. Well, I am worried. I can't say that I really felt confident beforehand, again, for all the reasons that I've given. Trump is Trump, and he's up against a lot. it is disturbing because you could say the one major improvement, in the situation, was the reimposition of restrictions on those ATACMS missiles. And if that's gone, then we really are back to where we are. Because the weapons have continued to flow. There was a hiatus of something like 3 days a couple of months ago, but that's it. It made no real difference. There's all those weapons. They're still flowing through the pipeline. The intelligence support is there. Nothing has really changed. The only thing that had changed, of course, was that policy on the ATACMS missiles. And if that reverts to the Biden policy, then we're exactly where we were. And I have to say, that's disheartening.
Well, we're probably not just back where we were. We're probably worse than where we were. I mean, the reason that we saw so much restraint from Russia on these ATACMS is because there was this knowledge that Trump was coming into office, and he's expressing that this is going to end right away. If Trump comes in and he lifts these restrictions and we start firing ATACMS and Storm Shadows back into Russia, then the Russians are like, well, okay, then we did what we could. We tried. We waited and we didn't retaliate. So let's just play this out. If this is lifted, because it seems like that's where we're heading, is where long range strikes might get approval again and the West begins firing missiles into Russia. How would Russia respond? How would you respond? How would you recommend Putin respond to something like this?
Yeah. Well, I'd probably respond emotionally, and that wouldn't be the right thing to do.
You're not that emotional. I would respond emotionally. You wouldn't.
Well, I would think about it, but yeah, it's a really tough one. Again, we've talked about this. It's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If Putin responds in kind and by striking NATO territory, and again, he would be justified in doing this. But you can imagine that's, I think, what Zelensky and his people are hoping for, because they think that could really bring in direct NATO involvement, much more so than just these ATACMS missiles, and Russia doesn't want that to happen, right? Now, on the other hand, if Russia doesn't respond, then they will be encouraging the West, NATO in particular, to continue to escalate. And you already get that kind of talk. It's like, oh, the Russians, they say these things, they don't do anything. What's this talk? We just don't need to worry, right? This is just a Russian talking point, and we have to do what we have to do. And that takes you farther up the escalation ladder. So, and then eventually the Russians really will have to respond when the situation becomes rather dire, and the response could be, all the more significant and all the more likely to maybe bring in NATO. It's a hard one. I'm glad that I'm not in Putin's position. I just don't. Again, it's just like his restraint is often interpreted as weakness. And then, but then when he does respond firmly, you get hysteria on the other side. And so what do you do, when you're dealing with an opponent like this? I really don't know.
Yeah,
I think like the Oreshnik was a good sort of threading of the needle. And we saw, again, the Iranians do something similar and in response to Israeli provocations. But you can only do that so much. At some point, that those demonstrative responses cease to have any meaning, and you have to do something substantive if the other side just ignores them.
Yeah, well, I don't know if Russia's done very many demonstrative attacks. There was just that one Oreshnik.
Yeah.
That was it. And I think there maybe needs to be a reminder to the West. Just get it through their thick skulls, what they're playing with. Have a real display of power. Because this narrative that Russia is cannibalizing their washing machines and fighting the Ukrainians with shovels, and they've lost over 1.2 million men. I mean, this is what Kellogg is saying, is that they've lost 1 million men. So if you hear that, you're just like, oh man, Russia's really weak. It's World War II casualties all over again, and it's just starting. So I think they just need to get it through their skulls. If it was me, I would say, like, you have to use an Oreshnik. Okay, it depends on if the Taurus does, like, they use the Taurus and does some real damage in Moscow, kills civilians or whatever, the pressure is going to be so big on Putin. I mean, and I feel like I feel like he might cave into that pressure, and it might be the right sense. I mean, even me, I'm at the point where if this happens, I'm just like, this is how I would do it. I would say, I would tell all the West publicly, state, okay, this is what you guys did. You guys fired a missile into Russia. You killed this many people, did whatever. We are telling you that, that this is a huge red line you cross. We don't want to kill people in Germany or in France or wherever, but we're going to strike this headquarters that we know where you guys are operating out of. We're going to strike it at this date, this time, prepare all of your air defenses, do whatever, evacuate it so we don't kill anybody, and then boom, everybody sits and everybody's waiting for the strike. And then, it's like what Iran did with Israel. They telegraphed it in advance. But I would, if I was Russia, I would give them a week advance, be like, hey, this is it, just to show that you couldn't do anything to stop this. Don't mess around. We can, if you really want to go to war, you guys are going to be in big trouble. Russia doesn't engage in decapitation strikes. It hasn't been going off after these command structures. It hasn't been going after Zelensky. They've been treating, unfortunately, the people of Ukraine and the munitions of the West. But it has the ability to go for the jugular if it wants to. So demonstrate that.
Yeah, well, they may have to do that at some point. One thing I would say in the meantime, like starting right now, is they should go back. I remember Putin and others doing this, last fall when Biden lifted those restrictions on the ATACMS. They explained why this was unacceptable. They explained the direct NATO participation in the operation of these missiles. And, of course, it was largely, almost entirely ignored in the West. But at least, you hope that some of that can get through, at least to the leadership. I think he has to go out and say it again. You would think that saying it once or twice, like I heard it, I understood it, but it seems like these people, they just inhabit a different reality. And at least at this point, it might not do any good. It probably won't do any good, but just go out and say that forcefully. Hey, you understand what's going on if you do this again. And, we went easy on you again, because we were led to believe, that by the Trump administration, there were rumors to this effect, that the Trump administration had notified the Russian government that they were not going to continue these strikes. So, so we went easy on you this time. But if these resume, we're going to have to respond in kind. I think they need to state it forcefully, clearly now.
Okay, well, I guess we'll see. I mean, no statements come out. It hasn't happened yet. So maybe, it'll turn around, but it just feels like the pendulum just swifted the other way. And if it does happen, then I think we're going to be at the most dangerous part of this conflict ever. This is going to be more dangerous than when Biden was in charge doing this, because, like I said, Trump's back. The reason that Russia was kind of holding off towards the end when those restrictions were lifted is because they were aware that Trump had this stance that this was not an okay policy. Trump puts this policy back in, we could be looking at more rapid escalation, and, Biden was awful, but Trump, it could be more emotional, and I could see it going. The one thing about Trump is that he goes fast with things, and you don't want to go fast when you're looking at an escalation ladder war going here,
Right. He's impulsive. Right.
Okay, well, and then the other really scary thing I think will be really telling just in the next month, we have a lot to look at, is this major Russian offensive that seems to be in the works. Can you tell us what you know about this Russian offensive? What people are saying is likely going to happen? Or
yeah, well, I guess most people now are looking at actually at Sumy. Where the Russians they moved in after driving the Ukrainians out of Kursk. They moved into, actually even before they drove them out of Kursk, they started moving into Sumy. Now, but they've continued to move at a relatively, I wouldn't say rapid rate, but at a very steady rate. They've taken a considerable chunk of Sumy, and I think they're now very close to like the main logistics hub in the main town before they actually reach the city of Sumy. So there is some thought because I think there's clearly a certain number of, like at least 50,000 soldiers that are just over the border in that area. So many people think that that's where it's going to come, but it could come. You know, they have a lot more than 50,000 soldiers in reserve. It's not clear to me how many they have. A lot of people mention these two armies that the Wall Street Journal reported on that are in northwest Russia, actually close to the Finnish border. Um, Say two armies with 250,000 men. But prior to that, you know, it was known that they had something like 150,000 north of Sumy, and then another, I'd heard like 100,000, or maybe it was 150,000 down in the Zaporozhye region. So I really don't know where these are going to come from. Before there was a lot of talk about Zaporozhye. I haven't heard it recently. There has been a lot of activity, actually. Kherson, again, like all those islands have been taken, and the Russians have established not. I don't think it's an actual beachhead, though they may have sent some, you know, reconnaissance forces over there occasionally. But on the right bank of the river, which is the Ukrainian controlled bank, they have established some sort of control, fire control over that. So there is this possibility. It seems very unlikely, you know, because again, river crossings are very dangerous. A lot can go wrong with them, but so far we've seen the Russians proceed very, very cautiously. But you never know. You know, I may decide that, again, it's just like if you establish a reputation for caution, that can actually make the occasional, you know, surprise move all the more effective. You know, it's a true surprise when you depart from that. So I don't think we can discount that entirely. So we look at Kherson, an outside possibility, Zaporizhia, and then also, you know, where they may actually concentrate the forces is right there in the east, where most of the fighting has been being done, in places like around Konstantinovka. You know, I don't know why I have problems with that. It's not that hard to say, but it's you know, it's a city there, or a large town right between Chasiv Yar, which is essentially fallen to the Russians. I think they've actually taken the city and are expanding from it in different directions. There may be just a couple of very small suburbs that still are under Ukrainian control. That's to the north of Konstantinovka, and to the south of Konstantinovka is Pokrovsk, and they've been moving around both of these cities, and actually have made very rapid progress. You know, something akin to a collapse is occurring right outside of Konstantinovka right now. So anyway, the thought is, and then farther south, another place where they've been moving is, when they move quite a bit, is to the east of, or rather the west of, Velika Novosilka. And that's a place, again, where they're actually getting out into the steppe. They've gone completely beyond the fortifications, and they've made, you know, very considerable, very significant progress there. And it may be that any one of these places, it's like the Russians are not going to tell us. We're all going to speculate, but they're not going to tell us where they're going to put their forces. And they may not even know. They just maybe monitoring the situation. Where they detect a weakness, they may make a last minute decision and push there. So it could be in any of these places. You know, by the way, I was just talking about Velika Novosilka and that area. They have gone so far to the west there that they've moved something like 30 miles from where they were in the summer of last year to the west. Okay, that's not a huge, but in this war, that's very, very significant. Now, I've heard it said, like a lot of the commentators on the western side will say, oh, you know, like they came to Pokrovsk, you know, that was in the summer of last year, and then they stopped. They haven't made any progress. You know, clearly they're just, you know, it's a stalemate. They're not able to do anything. They're sending these meat assaults, and they're not getting anywhere. It's really not true. They came to Pokrovsk, and a lot of people thought now it's going to be Pokrovsk, but they stopped and consolidated in Pokrovsk. But they've made lots of progress in other places. You know, just right there. You know, again, you know, down there in the south, Novosilka. Okay, yeah, they pretty much stopped for a while, across, but they moved 30 miles, to the west there in the south. And of course, during also, we had the collapse of Kursk, and there are other places where they made considerable progress. So that narrative, which I've heard actually several times, is like, oh, they came to, because that was the main focus in the summer, and then nothing happened, but then it happened everywhere else. And again, the Russians will do this. I think what happens is like, okay, the Ukrainians panic and they start just sending all their forces to that crisis point, which was Pokrovsk at that time. But they draw them from other places. And then the Russians say, okay, now we'll start pushing in those places. And I think we may see something similar again with the offensives. Again, they may decide that, oh gosh, it's going to happen in Sumy. And they'll send, they'll pull men off the lines in other places, send them up there. And then the Russians will see where the weakest part of the line is, and then they'll push hard there.
Okay. Yeah, but you believe that this offensive is likely going to happen soon. We don't know exactly where it's going to be, but there will be something. Or do you think that there's a good chance that it could just kind of do this slow grind like it's always been doing?
Well, I never know, because the thing is, I've heard talk of offensives for, 3 years now, major offensives, big aero offensives, and we haven't seen it. Now, this time I've just heard more chatter about it than ever before. And a lot of people are very confident. And just based on that, I don't have any inside information or anything. It's just kind of based on what the commentariat is saying, and even the Western intelligence. Yeah, I think so. And another thing, well, if it's going to happen this year, it probably should happen soon, like within the next few weeks. And the reason is that you get the mud season, about in October or so. So you would only have about 4 months, and it doesn't seem like it would make a whole lot of sense to try to launch one in August, if a major offensive, because you'd only have 2 months or so, and then it would have to slow way down. Now, they can still move forward. They proved that in the past, but it becomes more difficult. So, yeah, we'll see. It's just, I'll say I expect it, but I'm not entirely confident that it will happen, because again, it may be that it's just based on past Russian behavior. They may just decide that, hey, what we're doing now is still working. We're attriting the Ukrainian army, and we'll just keep on doing it until they just truly collapse, and then we can just march ahead, and suffer very, very few casualties. The Russians are very casualty averse. They're careful with their own men, and so that may be. Possibly that's a strategy. Again, another difference now is they do have a lot of men in reserve. And so it becomes much more likely. A year ago, they did have tens of thousands they could have drawn from, but now they have hundreds of thousands of well-trained men, very fully equipped divisions, and led by combat hardened, commanders. That's another thing they've done is they've, a lot of these soldiers have gained experience over the last couple of years of fighting, and they are, they take these men and they put them in these reserve divisions, or have them command the reserve divisions. So you have again divisions that are really ready to fight, and that certainly suggests that they will. Again, you see. Clearly, Ukraine is not able to hold the line. They're faltering in many places. And just additional pressure, let's say another 100,000 Russian men, it seems like that would just overwhelm. It seems to me anyway. Ukraine doesn't have the reserves. At one time they did, like in the first couple of years of the war, they could keep on plugging holes. And if an offensive had been launched, let's say a year ago, they probably still had enough reserves that they could just send them up there to wherever it was happening and slow it down and eventually stop it. But they do not appear to have the reserves now. So if the Russians, throw in 100,000 men, it's just the Ukrainians will not be able to counter it. If they send 100,000 men to meet them, they got to draw them from the line, and other parts of the line will collapse.
Do you think the Russians will be taking Trump's words into account when they're planning some type of offensive, or they're just going to disregard anything that he says?
Yeah, I think they have to disregard it. They may have slowed things down for a couple months on the hopes that maybe some real progress and an understanding could be achieved. But in the end, they have to fight the war, and I think they understand. They can't depend on Trump to, on Trump's good opinion of anything. That's obviously just not going to work. He has they just have to fight the war that they have to fight.
Right. But it's going to be scary because just the way that Trump's talking, he was so upset with this drone and missile strike into Ukraine, which wasn't really anything exceptional.
Yeah, right. Again, we're just talking about I believe the Ukrainians claimed there were 13 civilian casualties in Kiev. And, that's significant, but it's actually just not unusual when you consider the scale of this attack. We don't even know, like the main target of this attack in Kiev was actually a large factory. So some of those civilians may have been workers in the factory, this factory that was producing drones. And yeah, I don't want to celebrate the fact, but that's a legitimate target. And there's no evidence that in any way do the Russians target civilians. So, I mean, I guess he was watching CNN or BBC or Fox News or whatever, and how everything is packaged. Every time the Russians attack, they're deliberately going after apartment buildings and kindergartens or something, and he seems to honestly believe it.
Yeah, well, that's what's scary is, because what Trump said was that he's like, Putin's lost his mind. We're in the middle of talking and he does this. So he has this idea that basically we're in a dialogue. Nobody do anything, I feel like, in his mind. There's not really much of a dialogue going on between Russia and Ukraine. But somehow he has that in his mind. And so if there's this major Russian offensive, if he got this upset just from what the Russians did here and saying, we were talking, what's he going to do when the Russians all of a sudden make a huge push and all of a sudden they're marching on Kiev? It's like, okay. Then if Trump was upset before, this is where it gets scary. And then restrictions get lifted. And something we didn't talk about either about firing ATACMS and Taurus missiles is that, Russia has updated its nuclear doctrine, saying that if Ukraine jointly with the West are firing these types of missiles in there, we don't know if these have nuclear warheads in them. If you're firing something like a Taurus, which is capable of holding a nuclear warhead, we'll have to assume that it is a nuclear warhead, and we'll have to respond accordingly.
Yeah.
I don't imagine.
Well, I don't know that they have to assume, but they
can assume that.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I looked at it. It's just like what they did is like if a proxy, and clearly the Ukrainians are a proxy. Even if that proxy is not nuclear capable, but if they do, if their backers are nuclear powers, then they will treat them as though they were nuclear powers. And so it doesn't mean that like every missile fired will require a nuclear response on the part of Russia, but it does, let's say, lower the threshold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think, we'll see. But I'm a bit more worried now. I think both in what's happened in Gaza and here in Russia, we have, once there's a lull, a stop in something like we had the ceasefire in Gaza, and then it started back again. And then at that point, I think the intentions are just so clear to everybody of what's going on here, that this isn't just fighting Hamas or whatever it is. This is about ethnic cleansing now. It starts to become more apparent to the whole world after you have that pause and then restart it again. And I think it's going to be the same thing here in Ukraine, is that we had this pause and it looked like an easing of tensions and relationships being restored. But then if we go back to it, then it's done. It's over. It's become so clear to the whole world that this is the West fighting Russia. We can drop this pretense of, plucky little Ukraine is just having to defend itself and we're having some, we're just helping them along a little bit. It becomes clear that, no, this is the West that is now fighting Russia. We are openly talk. I mean, I think there's a British MP that was openly saying that, Ukraine is our proxy and we have to defeat Russia. I saw like Kaja Kallas is saying something that if we don't defeat Russia and Ukraine, then we will have World War III, which is the most ridiculous statement. At least that's what I saw going on Twitter. I don't know if that's actually what she said.
She's certainly capable of saying things like that. Yeah.
It's just, I don't know if people have thought this through. Like, even if you did, the worst possible outcome of the Ukraine war is if Russia does start to lose because they have all the nukes. So, like, what are we doing here? Has anybody thought this through? Like, even if you were able to effectively combat the Russians on the battlefield, that's terrifying. Right. You don't want that to happen because that can mean the end of the world.
Right. Yeah. No. I've understood that always from the beginning, and it amazes me that other people don't. Again, actually, when the war first broke out, your sister was in Moscow, and she was getting calls from the West, like, "Oh, you got to get out of there." And she had many friends and acquaintances, expats who left, but she stayed. And one reason, we had conversations, and I said that, look, if Moscow is threatened, then the whole world is unsafe. There's really no safe place to go. Maybe
South Africa,
Australia, or something, or South Africa, but. Right. Yeah, but you're not going to be safe in the U.S. either. I mean, it's just like there will be a real threat, a very, very real threat of nuclear war if Moscow itself is threatened. And that just seems so clearly true. So, I mean, these statements that you hear from people like Kaja Kallas, we're going to, I guess it's Kaya Kallas, that we're going to break up Russia or whatever. You really want to try that? If you actually start threatening the breakup of Russia, then we really, really could have, where Russia's very existence is threatened, then we could have nuclear war. It may not be, they might not go immediately to strategic weapons, but they, I bet they would start with the tactical, and there's just no preventing escalation after that point. So yeah, it's just utterly insane. And that's, again, something I think that we all understood, like through the Cold War with the Soviet Union, is that, no, we don't want to actually truly threaten Russia, the Soviet Union, because that could mean the end of the world. Let's not do that. But that's gone. And it's just like, again, there was a healthy fear and respect that's just absent now. And it just leads to this insanity. And I guess I'll just repeat what I said a couple of programs ago. It seems to me that it doesn't matter. Putin tries to lay these things out very rationally, and he'll make statement after statement, and his statements will be repeated by other officials, but it just doesn't seem to ever get through. They just don't. They all talk about, like, they still seem to think, or very much want to believe, that Russia's on the verge of collapse, and we just need to, deliver another ultimatum, another sanctions package, or whatever, and that's the way to do it, and then empower Ukraine. And well, there is this fundamental belief in Russian weakness that comes out of the 1990s, and they still seem to be holding on to it, and that has to end. And maybe it can only end through really by crushing Ukraine, unfortunately. I wish it could end through a settlement, but I think crushing Ukraine, and thereby, actually, obviously, ending Project Ukraine, which is, the NATO effort to use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, that has to be just utterly crushed. I think and at that point, you hope that there's some sort of awareness and a real fear. Maybe there's some sort of subconscious fear they have now, but they don't talk like it. They still talk like they're in charge, and they can punish Russia, and they can, deliver the next ultimatum, and so on and so forth. They still don't understand what they're dealing with.
Do you think that would actually even stop it at then? If they crush Ukraine? I don't, at this point, I don't think so. It seems like become mainstream opinion within the establishment that we have to destroy Russia. We have to bring Russia to their knees. I mean, even if Russia goes through and ends up taking the majority of Ukraine, going to have a huge insurgency problem. The West could still be funneling money and weapons to fuel this. It's almost like I think that it's NATO that needs to end, and NATO almost needs to be crushed at this point. It's like if your policies just bring Russia to your knees, and they keep on, it's such a stupid, dangerous policy, and they won't negotiate. They don't want to end it. You have to crush that idea. That you have to crush the idea that NATO is going to destroy Ukraine. I mean, the West has that policy set out now. I mean, destroy Russia. That NATO is going to destroy, or the West will destroy Russia, right?
Uh-huh. Well, you may very well be right. It's you would think at least there's some hope that that a real obvious. Well, again, we've talked about it's easy to deny what's happening, or relatively easy if you're in the West and you inhabit the mainstream media bubble to deny what's happening, because the movement on the map is still, is relatively minor. Yeah, let's be honest about that. And then you can just lie about everything else. Huge casualties on the Russian side. The Ukrainians are very cleverly holding them back with their drones, and it's just a matter. Eventually, the Russians will run out of steam, and then it'll be all over for the Russians. You can make that case if you just inhabit that mainstream media bubble, but if there is a major breakthrough, a real big aero offensive that goes all the way to the Dnieper, then it's you can't deny, you see it on the map, and it's hard to spin it in any way. And so maybe, but like I say, it just seems like their illusions, like you were saying, their illusions are so deeply rooted that even then, we may not see a change in policy, and we just may see increasing hysteria and increasing recklessness, and NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. All those things become a possibility.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the thing again. It's just with Putin is sort of like he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. Either way, if he shows restraint, he proceeds slowly because he doesn't want to provoke the West. Okay, that's perceived as weakness. But if he actually does push through, then he's a monster, and he's about to invade all of Western Europe, and we've got to do something.
I hate that we have to pin all of our hopes on Donald Trump.
Yeah,
it doesn't. It's not good for peace of mind. No, basically that's what it is. Because we know what the European leaders we want. We know what Merz, Starmer, and Macron want, and that's what all out war. They want us to go to war with Russia.
They appear to, yeah.
Right. So, and there's just this pressure. I don't know. They want to just go to sort of slow walk us into it, and can the mind of Donald Trump hold up to that? And it just, I just don't think so anymore. And then that's, I hate that that's where we are, that the fate of the world might be in just Donald Trump's mind. And it's just, can he stay strong and realize that, hey, this could lead to nuclear war. He was campaigning on, you are playing with World War III. He said that to Zelensky directly. You're gambling the lives of millions of people. You're playing with World War III. And yeah, okay. Well, I guess we can't speculate forever, so we'll just have to wait and see what Trump does, and if these missiles do get fired into Russia. Let's hope they don't, because then time to invest in bomb shelters, nuclear bunkers, right? Okay. Well, let's move over to Gaza just for a little bit, just to wrap things up. So there's some humanitarian aid that's been attempted to be delivered. We've seen some footage of this, people in cages, only 4 distribution points. Can you tell us the situation, what's happening here?
Yeah, okay, yeah. A certain number of trucks made it, were allowed to cross the border. Last I heard, it was like 110. And which again, it used to be before October 7th, it was 500 a day. And so this, and it's been nothing for the last, roughly 80 days, something like that. So this isn't anywhere close to enough, but it's something, right? But yeah, they're not using the UN distribution system. And the UN distribution, I think they had like 400 different centers throughout Gaza. Here we're just talking about 4. It's again also UNRWA, that's the UN agency that would distribute the humanitarian assistance. They're very experienced, have a large staff, and they know how to do this. It's not an easy task. Now this was doomed to failure from the start, because just 4 systems. You have a starving population, people that are just absolutely desperate, and the inevitable will happen it's just that these distributions, they try to create this system, I guess, again, where the people were funneled into these, what would you call them? It kind of reminds me like a chute or something,
right?
Like cattle
for livestock,
pasture.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, for livestock, exactly. They were funneled into these chutes, and then they were supposed to, each one of them, before that person was led into the to the distribution area, was going to undergo some sort of biometric exam, to verify the identity. And this just didn't, it moved very slowly. People were absolutely desperate. and, and they just lost control. I think it's just the crowd ended up it just stampeded. They pushed down the fences and just rushed to grab the food. And it was total chaos. In the end, I don't know how much food actually got distributed or was actually acquired by Gazan citizens, but it wasn't a fraction of this already small fraction it was only a fraction of this already small fraction that was being supplied to them on that day. It was a total failure, and a lot of people, including the UN, had said just isn't going to work. You don't know what you're doing. And yeah. I think probably the failure was intended. It was just symbolic.
Right. I mean, anybody that's been to a stadium or, to understand just the size of feeding this many people, obviously 4 distribution points is impossible. If you go to any large event, you got to have hundreds of food stalls and all these things. You can't, like, what do you expect? 250,000 people or something, like 500,000 people at one distribution center? That's ridiculous. It's absurd.
Right.
So is there any plan to change this? That will there be able to get aid in a different way, that they realize that this is a failure? I mean,
I haven't heard any statement about it, from Israel or from, what is it, the Gaza Humanitarian Organization, whatever that NGO that basically Israel with the help of the U.S. created. I haven't heard any statement about how they're going to proceed. So there was also a certain amount of looting, of trucks that had crossed the border. Now, it's not clear actually who did this looting. It's strongly suspected, with, I think, good reason that it was, Gazan gangs, maybe ISIS or Al-Qaeda affiliated gangs that did this, and with Israeli support. Now, you say this is just such a bizarre conspiracy theory, but Israel and the U.S. has a history of working with these kind of people, especially with Al-Qaeda. And Israel did it in Syria, quite openly. Again, the president of Syria is former ISIS, former Al-Qaeda. They're working with him quite directly. President Trump shook his hand. So it's not at all, I wouldn't dismiss that as just some sort of nutty conspiracy theory. I think it's quite possible that, almost likely, I would say likely, that the really? Israelis are working with those kind of elements that they find in Gaza.
I'm surprised those elements exist within Gaza, that there are elements that would be willing to work with Israel, the one that's enacting out a genocide in Gaza.
Well, I think in every population you find people like that. Even under these circumstances, there are true criminal elements that'll just work for themselves, no matter what. So it's not too surprising. And they may find, they may not actually be Al-Qaeda affiliated, but they realize that it'll help them with Israelis if they declare that they are, and they'll pretend to be, that could happen too.
Right. Yeah. And I guess if you have a population that you push into starvation and is, it could be easy to turn people to say, hey, you want to stay alive, then work with us.
Right.
Just such an awful situation.
Right. Yeah, no, that's very true. It's very true.
Well, we heard so little aid has come in, and 5 days ago or so, we heard this report that 14,000 babies would die in the next 48 hours. So little aid has come in. Do we know the plight of these children, these babies?
Yeah. I don't know. I have, apparently that hasn't happened. That may have been an exaggeration. I've heard like direct malnutrition deaths or something on the order of 60 or something, which seems to me surprisingly low, given what's going on. One thing to be understood, that may be true. And again, the Gaza health system is been so severely degraded, is under such strain. They just may not be aware of a lot of starvation deaths. And it has to be said, like the Gazan health authorities, they're it's Hamas affiliated, but they do have a very good reputation for truthfulness. And this goes back to previous conflicts. Like even the Israelis afterwards would admit, oh yeah, those statistics that that were supplying, they were true, and they've proven to be true. They're actually very careful, and so they report what they know, but they may not know. They don't know everything, obviously. They don't. There's a lot of, especially now, there's many places they can't even reach, so we don't know what the actual number is. I think like the recorded number is still less than 100. Now, this doesn't really tell you, though, the full impact of the starvation, because there are going to be a lot of deaths that had starvation as a contributing factor. People are already sick. People are very old. All these things they can, and they'll die years sooner because of the strain that they're under. But the death will be recorded as pneumonia or whatever, diabetes or kidney failure or whatever. It may be all these things, which may be true, but under normal circumstances with a normal diet, these people would have lived another couple of years. We won't know. Again, we won't really know the scale of death until this conflict ends and a real study can be done. And you have to look at past mortality statistics and then look at and calculate like what the above normal mortality. And I'm sure that it's well beyond the official statistics, not just because of the starvation, but because of everything else that's happened, damage to the health facilities, the lack of clean water, everything, lack of shelter, and so on and so forth. But we probably won't know the actual number until maybe, months or after it finally ends and people are allowed, if they ever really are, to study the results. That's what happened in the case of Iraq, for example.
You see any rays of hope for Gaza?
There is talk about, I've been hearing talk about negotiations between Hamas and the U.S., Hamas and the IDF over the last couple of weeks. And sometimes it sounds like they're on the verge of a breakthrough. And then, like, even there was a report that some sort of deal had been reached. And then no, Hamas blew it because they did this. No, the IDF rejected it. There is a chance that there will be some kind of ceasefire, but I just don't have much hope that this will endure, even if it does happen, just like the first ceasefire, because I don't think the Israelis have any intention of really honoring it in the long term. They will take it, they'll allow them to regroup and, get some more hostages. That helps Netanyahu. But they will renew their offensive. I think it's just clear that they're dead set on ethnically cleansing Gaza. And again, it's not just Netanyahu and his crazies. We talked about those poll results. It's Israel. They're in favor of strongly in favor of ethnically cleansing Gaza. So you say 70% want a ceasefire on the hostages, but 86% want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. So you look at those figures and you say, what's probably going to happen is, okay, maybe there will be a ceasefire. They'll get more hostages, and then the ethnic cleansing will resume. Yeah, I wish I could say something. That's not a ray of hope. It's really very, very grim.
Okay. All right. Well, thoughts and prayers to the people of Gaza. Anything else you want to add, or should we wrap it up?
I think that's sufficient for today.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks a lot, Dad. Have a good rest of your day. And if anybody catches this early, my dad will be on Garland Nixon's show at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So check that out. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot. Okay. Bye.
Okay. All right.